Now, when it comes to peace and security in Africa, 2016 has been a bumpy ride, with Boko Haram in the west, Al-Shabaab in the east, and Al-Qaeda aligned fighters in the north. Troops across the continent have been battling hard to keep conflict at bay. But terrorism was not the only threat in 2016. Political tension sparked clashes in various countries, including Burundi, South Sudan, and the Central African Republic. And in spite of unprecedented economic growth and efforts towards establishing peace, experts say the socio-economic impact of ongoing unrest could be felt for many years to come. So as 2016 comes to a close, what lessons can be taken from Africa's security situation over the past 12 months? And what can be done to ensure a peaceful 2017 for the continent? I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. Now, in the 1990s, terror attacks in Africa were somewhat episodic and limited to relatively well-defined areas. But the last decade has seen the emergence of groups like Boko Haram in Nigeria and the spread of Somalia's Al-Shabaab attacks into Kenya and Uganda, making terrorism a key security threat in Africa today. Let's take a short look at the extent of these activities in 2016.
In May this year, US officials stated that the number of people killed by terror attacks in Africa in the last year is as large, if not larger, than the deaths inflicted by ISIS in the Middle East. But the 2016 Global Terrorism Index, as researched by the Institute for Economics and Peace, paints a different picture. According to the report, the Middle East and North Africa region had the highest number of deaths and attacks, followed by South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. However, Sub-Saharan Africa also saw the largest decrease in deaths of any region. Of the top 10 countries on the Global Terrorism Index, Nigeria ranks in at number 3, after Iraq and Pakistan, with 588 reported incidents. But a coalition of the Nigerian military and forces from neighboring countries Cameroon, Chad and Niger, set up in 2015, forced Boko Haram out of areas in northeast Nigeria, driving a 33% decline in deaths. The next African country featured is Somalia in East Africa, coming in at number 8. While deaths from terrorism in Somalia decreased by 18%, the past year was still the second deadliest in Somalia. Over 90% of terrorism incidents in Somalia were carried out by Al-Shabaab, a group that has recorded attacks every year since 2007. Egypt and Libya round out the top 10 countries affected by terrorism, ranking 9th and 10th respectively. Terrorism in Egypt has increased to the highest level since 2000, with 493 reported incidents over 12 months. The Sinai province of the Islamic State was responsible for 78% of deaths from terrorism. However, it's likely that the group is responsible for even more deaths, as the perpetrators of 19% of deaths remain unknown. Libya recorded a 4% increase in terrorist fatalities, with 432 recorded incidents. The largest and most active ISIL affiliates are in Libya and have now become the most active terrorist organizations in the country. Over half of all attacks in Libya were bombings, with armed assaults accounting for 15% of deaths. Matthew Edwards, CCTV.
And now to offer further analysis into Africa's security situation in 2016, I have expert guest standing by in Johannesburg, Stephanie Volters. She's the head of conflict prevention and risk analysis at the Institute for Security Studies. In Lagos, Oluwaseyi Adetayo, security expert and retired official of Nigeria's secret police. And in Mogadishu, strategic and security analyst Hassan Sheikh Ali Noor. Thank you all for joining in the conversation. Stephanie, I'll start off with you with an overview of Africa's security landscape in 2016. What are your assessments, though, and thoughts on the trends we saw on Africa's security landscape in 2016?
Well, I think that the developments in 2016 are to a great extent extensions of what we've already seen happening over the last few years. We see some very positive things happening, I think notably with some of the progress made against Boko Haram by the Multinational Joint Task Force and by some of the the national task forces working against Boko Haram in the 4 countries affected by it. And we've seen some positive developments in other parts of the continent, but we've also seen some significant deterioration, for example, in South Sudan, with the unraveling essentially of the peace agreement and the government there. We've seen a continuing erosion of rule of law in Burundi and a hardening of the government's position there, growing instability in the Great Lakes region with the DRC and the delayed elections there. And also some big concerns in southern Africa, in Mozambique and in Zimbabwe.
Adesayo Oluwaseyi Adetayo, Boko Haram remained a major problem in the Western African region. Your assessment?
Yeah, it's a major problem, and it's still going to be a problem for a long while because there are basic issues surrounding emergence of insurgents and terrorist organization. And as long as major players in this are gaining upper hand globally, there will still be more people that will be encouraged to be involved in such activities. If you look at development outside Africa in terms of the emergence of the ISIS, we can see that ISIS is gaining more popularity, and the popularity is growing and spreading in Africa. In fact, we have more countries with ISIS in Africa than in the Middle East. And that's a potential danger, so to speak, in terms of Africa. And it's something that we actually need to start addressing critically, because the major issues that have been, encouraging young people to join, to volunteer to be part of ISIS, those issues are still there unaddressed. And as long as they still remain, more people will still be encouraged to be part of that crusade.
Hassan Sheikh Ali Nur, though Islamist extremism remained a feature for the Eastern African region with Al-Shabaab. How did East Africa fare, though, on the security front? Were there more terrorism attacks than in 2015, less? How did we fare?
First, let us say something about Africa as a continent hosting 54 countries or the states with different insecurity levels, and in one way or another, Africa as a continent, we don't have the single ideas or the single approach to analyze or to say this and that are the Africa's security crisis or the security assessment in general. However, if we come back to the Horn Africa or the East African countries, as you said, the Horn Africa or the East African countries, they are suffering in certain issues, insecurity, including the Islamic insurgency, the lack of political agreement, the lack of the shortage of resource, the lack of the societies unaccepting each other, or still the tribal or ethnic conflict, and so many cases that are there.
Right. Stephanie, I want to come back to you, though, because recently former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan did actually say that Africa is actually doing better than many people realize in terms of security of its citizenry, and that today armed conflict is actually a smaller risk to most Africans than, let's say, traffic accidents. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think, like my colleague in Somalia, I find it difficult to answer in general terms. I think that it's not often terribly useful to try and make generalizations about whether or not Africa is doing better or not. I think we do have to go country by country and region by region. I think that there's no question that there is still a significant democratic deficit on the continent. I think we have a lot of contested governments that aren't delivering the kinds of dividends on development that the populations want to see. And my colleague in Nigeria spoke about some of those root causes of youth taking up arms in the name of organizations like Boko Haram and many of the other movements that we see affiliated with ISIS across the Sahel and in North Africa.
Oluwaseyi, let's look at the specifics here of Boko Haram, particularly in the West African region. And of course, in that region particularly, there was a lot of regional cooperation to try and contain Boko Haram. How did that fare?
Okay, just like the previous, the other guest said, you say we have to look at this issue country by country, and it is also important that we understand that most of the efforts that have been made are usually directed at taking care of the symptoms, not actually the cause of the illness. There are so many social, fundamental social issues that are there that we still have to address. And largely, most African countries are not doing well in this regard. We have the issue of unemployment. We have the issue of, bad leadership, bad governance, lack of access to water, to good food, and education, and quite a whole lot. And you will see this, in West Africa and Africa as a whole. It's not about what we see in the capital cities of all these countries. It's about what happens interland in other communities, cities outside the country. Capital cities. We've got a whole lot of people there, and that is where organizations like this, they are focusing more on those villages, on those small communities, to go there and they recruit, promising them a kind of life that ordinarily they know that they cannot even achieve if they have to work for the next 40 years. And they believe that if they join an organization like that, it will help them. Concerning what is being done in terms of cooperation among countries in West Africa, I think it's largely between Nigeria and its immediate neighbors, that is Chad Republic, Cameroon, and the Niger Republic. There was a point in time when the synergy was high, but I think with time everything is actually going down because lack of, inability to be able to, meet commitment from their own side, the other countries to meet up with their own commitments as to what they need to contribute to be able to sustain this war against terrorists and against insurgency, insurgents. But by and large, beyond Boko Haram, beyond ISIS, there are other major social, insecurity, issues leading to insecurity in West Africa. We have the issue of smuggling. Smuggling is there. People are ready to kill for them to be able to, to lay their hands on these, precious stones, or to be able to smuggle around. We have the headsmen.
Oluwaseyi, in just a moment we'll come back to you for that. But I just want to rope in Hassan Sheikh Ali Noor here for just a moment and to find out the extent of the terrorism, though, in the Horn of Africa, in the East African region. Did you find, though, that in 2016, much of that has largely been contained?
Let me first to express my concern that what my friends from South Africa, what she said, Africa is a continent, and then we have to go to country by country or state by state, and then we cannot generalize. That's one particular. Secondly, what I want to do again, I want to explore again what's going on in the East Africa. Is the question is the sources of insecurity originated from inside the Horn Africa, or the sources of insecurity came from other part of the world? And what I want to say here, and then also, although my friend from Nigeria mentioned it partially, the part of the Africa's insecurity actually not originated from Africa inside itself, but from other part of the world, particularly from the Middle East. And then now, what the destabilizing or what creating the insecurity in the East Africa, the idea, the propaganda, the material used, and everything originated from other parts of the world, particularly from the Middle East. And then just use it here in the East Africa to destabilize the security. Therefore, when we are going to deal with such insecurity in the East Africa, we have to know well the sources of security, rather than just dealing with the consequence or the superficial. Meaning that if I summarize it, the more the level of insecurity in the Middle East increases, the level of insecurity in the East Africa or in Africa will increase.
Right.
And then in general, again, if the level of insecurity at the global level increases, the level of insecurity in the East Africa or in Africa will increase. And the reverse is, if it declines, it will decline. Meaning that the Horn Africa's or the East Africa's insecurity, it's related to other parts of the world.
And we are going to take a short break and return to that discussion in just a moment. And when we return, we'll delve deeper into conflicts in Africa in 2016. To stay with us. Welcome back to Talk Africa. Now, conflict in Africa in 2016 has not been limited to just terrorist threats. Many have been politically motivated. From Burundi to the Central African Republic, South Sudan to the DRC, ideological differences and political infighting have resulted in civil unrest, which has inevitably claimed numerous lives in the past 12 months. Let's recap some of those hotspots in 2016.
The East African nation of Burundi witnessed a spillover of unrest from 2015, the trouble stemming from President Pierre Nkurunziza's contested re-election, cited as unconstitutional and contravening the Arusha Accord of 2000. The ensuing political violence is reported to have led to 400,000 displacements of people, with half the number fleeing Burundi. Thousands have disappeared without a trace, according to the UNHCR. It has also been a period marked by alleged arbitrary arrests on the opposition, murder, and a crackdown on the media and civil society groups. The African Union's attempts to send in a peacekeeping force in January was met with criticism by President Pierre, and the continental body rescinded this proposal barely a month later. A UN independent investigation into Burundi also described abundant evidence of systemic gross human rights violations, possibly amounting to crimes against humanity. The situation remains volatile in Burundi, with no clear sight of lasting peace. In February, the Central African Republic held peaceful elections hailed as a great step towards restoring peace following 3 years of grueling sectarian violence. The new president's administration, however, still faced the challenge of healing a traumatized nation armed to the teeth and still divided as ever. In the months after forcing a Change's election, widespread attacks on civilians would remain rampant, with over 500,000 people displaced and thousands killed from the conflict between the Seleka and anti-Balaka militias. Further east, South Sudan's President Salva Kiir and his former deputy Riek Machar led the nation in signing a peace deal in April 2016. The new government of national unity would, however, collapse only a short time later in July, forcing Riek Machar into exile. The capital, Juba, hosted clashes between the government and rebel troops, leaving an estimated 272 fatalities. The 5-year-old nation's future prospects remain unclear, with a gross humanitarian crisis worsened by climate change and imminent famine. The Democratic Republic of Congo and Ethiopia have also witnessed their fair share of political unrest in 2016. The Ethiopian government's plans to expand Addis Ababa were met with resistance by the farming Oromo community, ushering clashes between police and protesters. Eventually, the government would cancel the said master plan in the wake of hundreds of reported deaths and arrests. The DRC's government also announced in October that it would postpone elections slated for November to April of 2018, a move read by critics as a malicious attempt to extend the incumbent's stay in power. The situation remains tense even there. Leslie Marungu, CCTV.
And we continue the discussion now, and I still have my guest standing by in Johannesburg, Stephanie Volters, Head of Conflict Prevention and Risk Analysis at the Institute for Security Studies in Lagos, Oluwaseyi Adetayo, security expert and retired official of Nigeria's Secret Service, and in Mogadishu, strategic and security analyst Hassan Sheikh Ali Noor. Stephanie, I'll return to you with the issue that Hassan Sheikh Ali Noor raised in just a moment there. He said insecurity is originating more externally than from internally in Africa, and that is what is causing destabilization in parts of the continent. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that's an analysis that may be applicable to the particular dynamics in the Horn of Africa, and that may be quite relevant there. And of course, I think if you look at the continent's history, I mean, there is a legacy of colonialism, there's the legacy of the Cold War, so things don't happen in a vacuum in Africa either. But I think that certainly when we look at some of the emerging conflicts, we need to look at also the quality of leadership, the commitment that political elites are making to really delivering for their populations. I think that we do have still, we can trace quite a lot of conflict back to the fact that the political and economic elites in certain countries simply aren't really working for the development of the nation. And so we have marginalization along geographic lines, along ethnic lines, along religious lines, and this often leads to disillusionment. And at the same time, we have still very imperfect electoral processes, often ones that lack credibility and legitimacy, and therefore the population doesn't feel that they've really been allowed to express their voice. And these are the kinds of things that do continue to drive conflict on the continent. And I think we really need to take a long, hard look both at the origins on the continent of that type of conflict and also at the kinds of conflict resolution mechanisms and the kinds of organizations that we have, such as the AU and some of the regional organizations, and how they also do address conflict.
And let's look at how Africa has been addressing those conflicts. Oluwaseyi, what about the African Union's response to the conflict situation on the continent this year?
Well, to me, I don't think that the AU have been able to do enough, and largely because AU has its own problem, and that is ineffectiveness in being able to carry out most of its statutes or being able to enforce most of these most times. And just like the issue you raised before, that yes, when issue comes from outside Africa, the extent of its effect on your own country or the countries in Africa would be determined by the level of security in the country. I mean, that would determine how well the country will be affected. For example, the issue of terrorism, because most of African countries are having issues with it. So when this thing comes, it becomes very difficult for each country, I mean, to be able to handle it compared to European countries or countries in North America where the effect on the country is not that much. Now, when you talk about insecurity in Africa, to me, as far as I'm concerned, we are the cause of our own problem. We have situations where, because of election, you see a whole country turning upside down. We've had
and I'll come to that situation in about many of the causes here, but Hassan Sheikh Ali Nur, though, I do also want to get a feel of the achievements that the continent has had on the security front, and particularly the impact of the African Union and the regional body IGAD that has been crucial in South Sudan, for instance. Have there been much achievement? Have we made a lot of gains here?
Actually, the African Union or the IGAD, in particular in Somalia, they are trying to do some job to get back to Somalia's security institution and then to make the Somali government a fable of the actual state to function or to regain its political sovereignty. However, what I want to share with my friends is different opinion. Maybe I'm some form of quite different from others. The problem of security in the East Africa, particularly in Somalia, and the other, of course, other countries, particularly Muslim countries or the Muslim people in Africa, maybe quite different from to analyzing their political insecurity in different ways. For instance, those who are creating right now, or we assume they are creating the insecurity, they are reading the political process in the particular country or in Africa through to text or the reading material which actually related to the Islamic political perspective. Well, others reading the political process through to the secularist political perspective.
Right.
And these two readings are conflicting. And these two readings are conflicting or even contradicting. And if we try to overlook or to try to escape, not to look or to read these insecurities sources in proper way, looking that angle, we may misunderstood or underline the real sources of insecurity.
Well, I do want to look ahead now, and very briefly though, Stephanie, looking forward to 2017, what are your predictions for Africa's security outlook, and what do you see?
Well, I think that we will continue to see the hotspots that we've seen this year: South Sudan, Mali, the Lake Chad Basin area that's affected by Boko Haram, Somalia, possibly also Ethiopia in terms of internal unrest, and certainly the Great Lakes region, where we have Burundi already in a state of conflict, and the DRC possibly heading that way. We have the Central African Republic that's recovering from a significant conflict, and we have in southern Africa Mozambique, where I think there are some very, very real concerns about how things will go there with remnants of the Renamo rebel movement. And then of course we have North Africa, where we have quite widespread instability around Libya, and many of the different issues related to organized crime and people smuggling and migration and trafficking and various other different key issues in a conflict cycle there. So I think that we're going to see continued efforts to try and improve those situations. But I think, you know, we also need to look at the bigger picture about the quality of governance that we see on the continent. Otherwise, we're going to be starting to see, I think, new levels of conflict, and possibly lower scale and not full-on armed conflict with rebel groups attacking governments, but just civilians increasingly disillusioned with the democratic system, and perhaps drawing conclusions about how best to see a change of leadership.
Right. Oluwaseyi Adetayo in Lagos, your predictions for 2017 on Africa's security landscape?
Yeah, the way I look at it, I believe that so many external factors will determine what is going to play out next year. Where the foreign policy, direction of the new government in the U.S., the United Nations, and also AU will have a lot of impact to play. Most importantly, the issues in Syria, the ability to be able to tackle ISIS issues in Syria will play a major role in trying to address some of these issues in Africa. We have the issue of Somalia, the issue in Libya is also there. We have and so many other countries as we speak in Africa today. So for 2017, lots of majorly I see like the issue in Nigeria to still progress till next year. But most importantly, how well we'll be able to manage this will be determined by majorly the effects of the actions of these major blocks, that is the United Nations, the American government, in terms of how they want to handle the problem in Syria, because it's actually affecting Africa greatly in terms of terrorism, most of these proliferations of arms and instability in most of these countries leading to proliferation of arms. And when you have proliferation of small arms and even heavy arms this time around, it leads to increase in criminality and crimes right. in African countries. So we should just keep our fingers crossed and see how the international politics outside Africa will help in reshaping security in Africa next year.
And unfortunately, we've run out of time for this week, but thank you to my guests for their insights. In Johannesburg, Stephanie Walters, Head of Conflict Prevention and Risk Analysis at the Institute for Security Studies. In Lagos, Oluwaseyi Adetayo, security expert and retired official of Nigeria's Secret Police. And in Mogadishu, strategic and security analyst Hassan Sheikh Ali Noor. Remember, you can join the conversation online through Facebook, Twitter and YouTube. And do join us again next week for more on Talk Africa. Goodbye.